Hello and welcome to watchandlearnphotoshop.com. In today's tip, I'm going to show you how to create a gradual focus change in a photograph, and this works especially well in a photograph of something that's in perspective, especially something like a field of flowers like we see here. In this picture, what we're going to do is we're basically going to change the focus of it so that the flowers up front in the front of the picture are extremely focused, and the focus just kind of blurs more and more and more as we get towards the back of the picture. Well, how do we do that? Well, we're going to use a Gaussian blur to create the out of focus effect. However, we don't want to just select a square of some of the flowers in the background and make that into a Gaussian blur, because you'll see a very definite line where the focus stops and the blurred section starts. So what we want to do is kind of create a gradient of Gaussian blur, if you will. And the way we do that is we need to make a gradient selection. Well, how do we make a gradient selection? Well, let me show you. We're going to look here for a second at the Quick Mask tool. If we click here to edit in Quick Mask mode, down here near the bottom of our toolbar, you'll notice that anything we paint in black, I'm going to switch to the paintbrush tool here real quick. Anything we paint in black on the stage will show up in red when we're in Quick Mask mode. And then when we switch back to normal mode, we have just made a selection with what we have drawn. And you'll notice that whatever was red is the only part of the stage that is not part of that selection. Okay, so that's basically how Quick Mask mode works. I'm going to hit Control D to deselect everything. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a gradient in Quick Mask mode, so that when we switch back to regular mode, that gradient will become a gradient selection. So let's switch our colors to black for the foreground and white for the background, just by clicking on this little icon down here, or you can just hit D on your keyboard. And then we're going to switch to Quick Mask mode once again, and now we're going to create a gradient. So we're going to select our gradient tool, which is underneath the paint bucket tool if you don't have the gradient tool already selected. And make sure that you have the foreground to background gradient selected up here in your properties. If you don't, we'll click on that gradient. Then in our gradient editor, you'll notice in the top left corner here is this foreground to background gradient. That's the one we want. So click on OK. And our gradient is going to go from black to white. So let's draw our line from the top of the stage to the bottom, holding on to Shift as you drag down to keep it straight up and down. And there we go. You'll see this stuff at the bottom is in red, and remember, red is going to be the portion that's not selected. The clear portions up here are going to be the parts that are selected. And since this is a gradient, since it's just gradually fading to red here, our selection is going to be a gradient. So we're going to switch back to regular mode, standard mode if you will, and you'll notice that it just looks like a rectangle has been selected on the stage. And the reason that is because it's kind of hard to show with our selection mode. It's really hard to show that a gradient is selected. It just shows, for instance, this cutoff point right here in the middle of the stage is basically the cutoff point where less than or more than 50% of the pixels are selected, if that makes sense. Once we get below this line where there's no more, where it looks like there's no more pixels selected, that's going to be the area where less than 50% of the pixels are selected. So if that makes sense, fine. If it doesn't, fine. We'll just move on, and you'll definitely see that this is a gradient when we apply our effect. So with the top half of our screen selected here, we're just going to go to the Filter menu. We'll go to Blur, and we're going to choose Gaussian Blur. And then, just depending on what your picture looks like, you're going to need to adjust the radius, but you'll see right away what's going on here. If we bring this radius way up, we'll be able to see what the effect is. At the top, it's extremely blurred, but as we move down, it becomes more and more into focus. So that's basically what we did when we went into Quick Mask mode and made a gradient and made that gradient into a selection. So that selection is really a gradient. Okay, now we don't want to blur it this much, obviously. That looks horrible. So we're going to bring this radius down to a point that looks good. And we want it to look kind of dramatic, otherwise we're not really going to add much to this picture. We want it to look a little bit dramatic, but not too much. So right around 2 is about good, and we'll click on OK. There we go. Now we can hit Control D to deselect everything, and there is your effect. The flowers in the foreground of the picture are nice and in focus, and it gradually gets out of focus as you move towards the top of the picture, as you move away from the camera. So that's a really cool effect that can really enhance your photograph, give it a better sense of depth than you would have had otherwise. So thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and I hope you find some creative ways to apply it to your own photographs. So we'll see you next time.